Perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you, ladies, for letting me come tonight and teach you about the Book of Numbers. For those of you who may not know me, I am Diana, and my last name is Jackson. So thank you again for letting me have the honor of coming up here and teaching tonight. So last week we wrapped up the book of Leviticus, and in that we learned God's rules and instructions for holy living. And we also learned about worship as God's covenant people. So this week as we start Numbers, the first thing I wanted to kind of go over with you was how it got named the Book of Numbers. The word in Hebrew is, let me see if I say this right, Bimidbar, and it means in the wilderness. However, early translations in the Greek and the Latin, they had their own words for them. But they basically meant numbers. And both of those things are very applicable to this book. We will see a lot about being in the wilderness, and we'll see a lot about counting and numbers and censuses being taken. This book is written by Moses, which is the fourth book in the Pentateuch, also known as the Torah, or the books of Moses, or the book of the law. Those are all kind of the same thing. And it was written approximately 1446 BC to 1406 BC. It was written to the Israelites fleeing Egypt, but it was also written to the next generation after that, as we will see that the next generation will actually be the warriors and leaders who receive the promised land, not the generation that leaves Egypt. For tonight, since we're kicking off a new book, we're going to just kind of give a brief overview of the entire book, and then we'll go into our chapters for our reading this week. So the book of Numbers shares a story of Israel preparing to leave Mount Sinai after exiting Egypt and head to the Promised Land. As some of you know, this journey will take about 40 years. However, maybe not all of you know that, because we have a lot of people in our group that are new to the Bible and new to learning. So it will take about 40 years. However, geographically, it should have taken about 11 days. So I did, in the back of your packet, give you kind of a little map just to kind of give you an idea of their journey on the top. The reason it will take approximately 40 years is mainly due to their rebellion against God. During the 40 years, we'll see a gradual fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham's descendants to occupy the land of Canaan. And we'll see man's rebellion or lack of faith in a covenant God cause that delay. Now, if you guys remember, Marilyn brought up last week, but definitely in her teaching in Leviticus, that God was trying to get the Egypt out of them. They had been in bondage for a long, long time, and so they kind of learned a lot of the Egypt's ways, cultures, and pagan ways of life. We will have two censuses taken of the Israelite military men, one in the beginning of the book and one towards the end of the book. And I want you guys to take special note of the differences and the similarities in these two censuses. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Throughout the book, we will also see part of God's character in that he continues to be a covenant God. Even in the midst of man's failings, covenant is very important to him, and he will keep his promises to Abraham. If you remember, God said to Abraham, "You shall be my people, and I will be your God." I also kind of wanted to give you a reminder just of God's original covenant with Abraham, which included the land, Canaan, the descendants, his covenant relationship, and that they will someday be a great nation, and they will be a blessing to the other nations. The Lord's presence is consistently highlighted throughout this book. So see where you see his presence and his character. This book will primarily have 3 stages. It will cover preparation to leave Mount Sinai. It will cover approximately 39 years journeying from Mount Sinai to Kadesh, and then a short time in the plains of Moab, just outside of Canaan, just before they cross the Jordan River into the land. In this book, we'll also see a lot of man rebelling against God and the outcome of that rebellion. But we will also see two men of exemplary faith, Caleb and Joshua. Whether we see rebelliousness or faithfulness, we will see God reveal himself through patience, through justice, through love and faithfulness. We will also see several items that mirror or provide similarities to our Messiah, Jesus. For example, like the Israelites, Jesus came out of Egypt, and that's in Matthew 2:15. He also went out into the wilderness, and that's in Matthew 4:1. He, however, was tested by Satan for 40 days. He passed the test. The Israelites didn't do so well. So they end up being 40 years, at least approximately. So that's a big ouch. This made me think in my own life, where have I been unfaithful or rebellious to God and delayed his plan for me in his life, or my life, and caused delay when I could have been further along. It just really made me think about my own life. And I can tell you, I'm at a point where I'm not doing that anymore, or at least I hope not. See what other areas you can find similarities to Jesus and the coming Messiah, because there's going to be a lot of opportunity in this book. Okay, so that's kind of our overview of the book itself. And then now let's dive into, and I have written on there chapters 1 through 10. I wanted to say, in your reading schedule, it does say 1 through 9. However, ending through 10 was a better stopping point. So I kind of made a decision and did 1 through 10. So if you want to make a note on your paper, it's 1 through 10. And then if anybody's watching this video from the day session, you probably did 1 through 9. So that was accurate in your reading schedule. Some themes for the first 10 chapters of this book is that God is holy, and because of his very nature of righteousness, purity, and justice, he cannot be in the presence of sin. Or perhaps maybe a better way to say that is we can't be in his presence because he's so holy and pure. And so a lot of this in your book, you'll see people will die if they don't obey and they come into his presence without doing what the mandated steps are. I thought about something that might help us understand that a little bit better. I know I've talked to a few gals that just are kind of struggling with that concept. And to me, it made me think of what's something physical in our life that we can relate that to, the two things that come into contact. And I thought about bleach and bacteria. Bleach is kind of a cleaning, it's pure, and it will kill the bacteria if those two come into contact. So that's kind of my analogy to that, is that God is so pure and holy and clean, and then if we come into contact with him, that's the inevitable thing. But we have hope because we have Jesus coming to take care of it. The other good news with that is God does not want us to die. Remember, part of the covenant is he wants covenant relationship with us. He wants to be with us. He doesn't want that to be the outcome. And that's what we're learning right now. He's trying to put steps in place for them to be holy so he can dwell with them, and he can be with them. So the first 10 chapters you'll see that theme of the covenant relationship with him. You'll see that God is a God of order, and he does things in an orderly fashion. We'll see that God keeps his promises, and that's always good news. And then we'll see the continual theme of the counting or census in these first 10 chapters. So in chapter 1, it will start off with one of those censuses of the Israel warriors. And this would be a counting of all males 20 years or older that were available for war. And there, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be one towards the end of the book as well. But again, I want you to notice the two differences. And I want you to keep in mind when you're looking for those differences and similarities that one is from the first generation and one is from the second generation. You will also notice in chapter 1 that the Levites will not be a part of this census because they are exempt from the census because God chose them to set up, tear down, and move the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. Interesting note about the Levites. They were the lowest of the three orders of the Israel priesthood. And originally, Israel's priests and temple personnel were chosen from the firstborn of every family in Israel. The Levites, however, were chosen to do this honor and task of taking down and setting up the tabernacle, because in Exodus 32, when we learned about the people worshiping the golden calf, they were the only tribe that stood up and said, this is wrong and no. This is that's why God selected them. So also look in this section how God reveals his character and goodness towards us in this decision. And see how this relates to our future Savior Jesus. In chapter 2, we will go over the arrangement of the camp. And again, I put a little picture on the back to kind of give you maybe a little idea what that might look like. But we see that the tent of the meeting or the tabernacle is going to be in the middle. And then we have all the different tribes, and they're going to set up their tents all facing inwards to the tent of the meeting and tabernacle, which is where God dwells. And that's per the Lord. This is the way it's to be done in an orderly fashion. But I also want you to keep in mind that's going to be a whole lot of people, because there was close to a couple million people leaving Egypt. Again, what does this chapter tell us about God's character? Like I said, it shows he's orderly, but it also shows he wants covenant relationship. He wants us all focused on him and in that relationship, all pointing towards him. In chapter 3, we'll read about the sons of Aaron. And just to again remind you, Aaron's the high priest. And his sons, he has 4 of them. They're anointed as priests underneath him. And he will have 2 sons that will choose to bring unconsecrated fire before the Lord. Which is, again, it's not purified and it's not set apart for God. It's not consecrated. Unfortunately, they know what they're doing, and they do it anyways. And so they bring the unconsecrated fire before the Lord, and they also die before the Lord. So now Aaron has 2 sons left, and they will continue on as the priests. We also see another counting or census in this chapter, where we take a counting of every firstborn Levite male, 1 month and older. And in this section, that normally, I kind of lost my train of thought here. Normally God would take the firstborn of every male instead of the firstborn of the males of the other tribes. This section will provide some interesting reading on the redemption of those firstborn, so again, pay special attention. And lastly, Moses and Aaron's sons are called upon God to guard the sanctuary and protect the people of Israel. In chapters 4 and 5, as we move on in the book, we will read about specific instruction for tearing down the tabernacle by the Levites and the priests. And one thing to note is only the priest, however, could handle and be in the presence of the most holy items. So we're talking about things like the Ark of the Covenant, the altars, the lampstand. And again, ask yourself, why is this? So if anybody else did it, they would die. So as you're reading this section, I want you to think about why this is and why God put this in place. We then learn about unclean people being put out of the camp, as they will defile the camp, and they cannot be in the midst of where God dwells. Do you guys see a pattern or a theme in all of this? Think about that in your reading. And I also want to just say one other thing about the unclean people. Again, as Marilyn taught in Leviticus, just because you were unclean didn't mean necessarily you did some type of sin. There were other things that could make you unclean, and it was not necessarily something that was sinful. But you had steps you would take that we learned about in Leviticus about how to become clean and when you would be free from that. Sometimes you had a waiting period of 7 days and such. Okay? In chapter 6, we will read about the vow of the Nazirite and Aaron's blessing. So what is a Nazirite? A Nazirite is a person who's made a vow of service to God. And that service sometimes could be a vow for a specific time period, like a year or 5 years or what have you. Or it could be a lifelong vow of service to God. You could recognize people by their outward signs of growth of hair. So they wouldn't cut their hair, the beard. They would also abstain from wine and alcohol. And the uncut hair showed others their dedication and their service to God. Some examples of this would be Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist. In the end of the chapter, the Lord instructs Moses to tell Aaron and his sons to bless the people of Israel and give them specific words to speak over them. I'll let you guys read about that. But then God ends the statement with, "So they shall put on my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them." Again, pointing back, he wants covenant. Chapter 7, we'll talk about offerings at the tabernacle's consecration. And we read about the consecration of the tabernacle by Moses. The offerings will be brought by the chiefs of the 12 different tribes. You will also notice that the tribe of Judah takes the lead here. And they're also going to take the lead on a few other things in this chapter. So take note of that. And one thing to keep in mind is that David and Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. So I'll give you a little hint, okay? And then chapter 8, we'll review the 7 lamps and the cleansing of the Levites. God designed a lampstand, and Aaron was the person set to set that up. Again, he's the high priest. And I don't know if you guys remember, if everybody was here, but back when Jan taught, and she brought in a lampstand for us to look at as just an example, and she was reminding us that the lampstand had things on it that were representative of the Garden of Eden, and then where the candle sat was like a flower that sat in, the candle sat in it. Again, this was all designed by God, so just keep that in mind. We will also learn in this chapter about the cleansing of the Levites and how this made them fit for service for God and for them to be able to serve in the tent of the meeting. The Levites would end their service at age 50 and retire from that serving in the tent of the meeting. And then chapter 9, we will read about Passover being celebrated and the cloud and the fire. So we read about God telling the people to remember and celebrate Passover. I think I've already told you this a couple times, but why do you think he did this? Again, when you're reading it, I want you to think about that. And again, if you were unclean, you were not to participate in the Passover, and you would have to wait for the next time. Again, this all points us back to God's holiness as well. And in this chapter, we are introduced to the cloud by day and the fire by night. And God's presence is in the cloud and the fire. And if the cloud moved, the people would move. If it stopped, the people would stop. And if it stayed in place for a long while, then they would just stay in place. So again, why do you think God hides himself in the cloud and the fire? I want you to think about that. And then our last chapter, chapter 10, will cover the silver trumpets and Israel leaves Mount Sinai. So the silver trumpets were used to signal people for different events. So such as when the camp was leaving, or if they were going to war, or it was time for a festival, and they would have different signals for each of those types of events. So everybody knew what was going on, and when to go, and when to stay, and things like that. So again, God's a God of order in using those, and communicating and helping his people. Well, we're now ready to leave Sinai. Woo! And the Ark of the Covenant goes out 3 days ahead of them and finds a resting place for them. And you will see that in verses 33 and 34. Again, see if that sounds familiar to you at all and where else you might have seen something similar. Okay? So that's what I have for you tonight. So next week we'll pick up and the Israelites have just left Mount Sinai. I really, really hope you guys enjoy your reading and studying this week. It really is some great scripture and great learning. It's packed with so much fascinating revelation of God to us, man's rebellion, the redemption of God back to us, and then that forward pointing to Jesus.